So, hi, this is Basil with TechSparks. I have with me Steve Blanks, one of the most popular figures in the lean startup world,
Hi.
and also the author of the 4 Steps to Epiphany. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
So let's start by asking the first questions, which is about the book, the 4 Steps to Epiphany. You covered all subjects from bringing an idea to market execution. The book also offers insights into what makes a startup succeed, and also leaves others feeling selling furniture. Can you please tell us some key points about that?
Sure. So the 4 Steps to the Epiphany is probably the first handbook written particularly for entrepreneurs. It's very different from the things that you learn if you went to business school and got an MBA. If you actually go to business school, you learn essentially how to manage and administer large corporations. You learn about HR and finance and manufacturing and operations. In fact, you learn everything about executing an existing business model. What we didn't understand for the last 50 years in Silicon Valley until I wrote this book, and then others have followed, is that startups are not about the execution of a business model. Startups are about the search for a business model. What the 4 Steps to the Epiphany does is point out the specific things that entrepreneurs searching for a business model need to do. And the biggest one is around the fact that there are no facts inside your building. So you need to get outside and get some customer input before you start spending the long march in building your product.
Phenomenal. So looking at your background, and you participated personally in 8 startups and you co-founded those companies. Looking closely at Pixar, you said that it had an obscure origin. Can you please comment on that?
Right, so Pixar was not one of the 8. I happened to be consulting for Pixar in between the 8. But I was at Pixar when they were a hardware company. Pixar actually spun out of Lucasfilm with a device called the image computer, which was a way to manipulate movie resolution film. And there was just a small group there who was interested in making movie shorts and then animating TV commercials, but secretly harbored a vision of someday actually getting enough computing horsepower to make a movie. And that, of course, was John Lasseter's group. And over the years, Pixar abandoned hardware and then abandoned commercials and then abandoned everything else to become the company we now know as the preeminent animation and movie company in Hollywood.
So it's often known that we have a process to manage product development, but we have no process to manage customer development. Your fix to this is to build a customer development process. Again, can you please give us some insights about that?
Sure. The customer development process basically says, again, there are no facts inside the building, and what you really need is to organize your thoughts about the startup. And what we now believe is that every startup, every large company, in fact, every company has implicit in it a business model. Now, it used to be you'd get 3 professors in a room, and then you'd walk out with 12 definitions of what a business model is. Over the last couple of years, we've now kind of standardized, at least here in Silicon Valley, that a business model is the one that's described in Alexander Osterwalder's book, Business Model Generation. He says, look, any startup, you got 9 things you need to worry about. What are you building? That is, what are you offering customers? We call it the value proposition. What's the service or product? 2 is, who are the customers? Well, good, we ought to figure those out. 3 is, how are you going to reach those customers? What channel? Is it direct on the web? Are you going to have a sales force? How are you going to create demand? He calls that customer relationships. And then, what's your revenue model and pricing strategy? Then, do you have any partners? Do you need any key resources? Do you have any special activities you need to do? And then, what's your expense model? These 9 boxes are the first step that we suggest that any entrepreneur needs to do. And we call this extracting your hypotheses. That is, hypotheses, by the way, are a fancy word that we use at Stanford and Berkeley because students pay a lot of money. But outside the building, it's actually called guesses. So we're actually going to now make you take all your guesses, write them down, put them up on a whiteboard, and stare at them for a while. And in the old days, that's all we would do, because then you'd go back and code. But we now know that all you have are guesses. So we take all those guesses, we let you keep writing what we call the minimum viable product, that is the first core piece of what hypothesis you want to test about your product, and then you get outside the building and you start testing each one of the business model hypotheses with a formal process called customer development. And that customer development process is, again, the core of what the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, the book about that testing process is. And what this does is just eliminate tens or hundreds of the early mistakes most startups make. Because implicit in that customer development process is 2 or 3 key ideas. One is this thing I alluded to before called the minimum viable product. Instead of building the entire product, shipping it, and getting customer feedback, we now say, no. Build the smallest unit of something that will get you feedback or orders, or you're looking for the smallest thing you could do. Maybe even get the website up and see if you could get people to even push a button that says, push me, right? Just to test whether you could get them. Then the second key idea is this notion of a pivot. And a pivot is really a startup-centric concept that says, do you know, in startups, we don't actually go from success to success like a big company. We actually go from failure to failure. If you actually think about how startups really work, what people never told each other, is that most startups aren't succeeding most of the time. They're actually running a series of, in the past, unconscious experiments. Now we're just going to make them conscious. And we're going to say, listen, we want you to try this, and don't worry if it fails. We'll just know that it's going to fail, but we're going to learn from every one of them. And so we do a series of hypothesis tests, most of them which aren't right. So we'll either iterate, which means slightly change, or pivot. And my definition of a pivot is when we substantively change one or more of our business model components. And the way we get to a pivot is we get a lot of customer feedback, and no customer says you need to pivot. It's the data comes back to the entrepreneur, and if they're great, they will extract an insight, and it will be one of these moments where you go, oh, this is what they're trying to tell us. What if we actually talked to a different customer? What if we did freemium versus subscription? Or what if we did something else? That's when those pivots happen. And then the third piece is speed. That entrepreneurs are all about fast and rapid testing and iterations and hypothesis testing and etc. Speed eliminates cash burn, or at least dramatically compresses the amount of cash and time you need, which is the enemy of startups.
So if you were to name a few companies in the tech space right now who are doing that?
To me, the best examples are Groupon and Zynga. I mean, Zynga is just a machine in iterating on customer feedback. And Groupon essentially started with a customer development process.
Sure. So jumping to a subject within the cycle that you mentioned, the product launches. Some of them succeed and some fail. Why is that?
Well, it turns out that for years, and even still today, startups somehow think they need to launch their product. Just like a big company. Well, big companies have launches, so therefore I need to have a launch. Well, big companies launch because they already have existing customers, and when you typically see a company launch, it's about the second, third, or fourth product. But for a startup to launch, it sometimes doesn't make any sense at all. Do you remember Google's launch? You do?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they never had one.
Absolutely.
Google never had a launch. Right? The point is that startups sometimes confuse that you want your mother to read about you versus getting customer demand to your site. So you should really deconstruct what it is you want to do with what you call a launch. Are you looking for funding? Are you looking for demand creation? Are you looking for business press? Are you looking for ego gratification? It turns out a lot of incubators force their startups through peer pressure to launch. But no one ever backs up and says, what exactly are we doing? Because the problem is you never get a chance at launching twice. The press doesn't cover you again when you say, oh, remember our initial idea? We really made, we made a mistake. No, what you want to do is spend the time getting it right. Figure out why you want to create demand and who you want to create it for, and then launch.
So my next question is about product development. I know we touched up on that already, but mainly for a web startup. What is the product development like for such a company?
Sure. So, web startups have it incredibly easy, right? Nowadays, you can develop on your laptops, right? You use Amazon Web Services or Rackspace or something in the cloud where you could offload the cost of normally having to buy workstations or computing or hardware, etc. You're just buying computing as a utility. But really the goal for a web startup and for an entrepreneur, which usually confuses them, is they always tend to think, oh, no, I have my entire vision. We're building my vision now. We're building all the features. We're arguing about the UI. We're arguing about the buttons. No, that's not what you're doing if I'm involved. What we're building at first is what I call a low-fidelity website. Is I want you to test your assumption of what the problem is, and then show me what you think a solution would look like cheaply. Oh, I think the problem is people really want to go do X. Good. Get me a couple of those people on the website and just put up, we do X. If you're interested, push here. And see if you could get anybody to agree with you about your assumption of their problem. And so what we do, if you're following a customer development process on the web, is test all the key assumptions in your business model. We're solving this problem. Great. So you're solving that problem? So if I get people to your site and you say that, you should have hundreds or thousands of people pushing this button that says, I agree, taking them to the next page, right? Oh, absolutely. And of course, the answer never works out like that. So what we do is construct, at least in my model, a website based on these minimum kind of feature set ideas rather than engineering the entire product end to end. Which is very different from the, let's argue about whether the button should be blue or green or whether the UI is perfect. I actually go, those are important, but they're second order effects to, are we solving a problem or satisfying a need that people have identified or feel that's important?
Okay, so let's talk about the Lean Launchpad.
Yes.
How has that been so far, and if you have any plans for going global with it?
So the Lean Launchpad is a class that I first taught at Stanford University in the engineering school, has now been adopted by UC Berkeley Haas Business School, and as well as the Columbia Business School. And then in 2011 was adopted by the U.S. National Science Foundation to teach scientists and engineers. And what it really is simply a class that takes students, forms them in teams, and from day one has them constructing a business model diagram, building their product in the class, whether it's hardware or software, and then getting out of the building and marching through who are our customers, can we create demand, what's the channel, etc. And if you're building a web-based product, the goal is in 8 weeks to get orders. The record so far is I've had a consumer products company get $1.5 million of orders in the middle of the class.
Wow.
And,
that's phenomenal.
And in the last class that just finished, 21 hardcore science and engineering teams. I mean, things making graphene and chlorine sensors and, real science and engineering. We would have been happy if 3 out of the 21 teams would have decided to move forward as a company. And we were kind of stunned and a little embarrassed that 19 out of the 21 have decided to continue forward to get funding and become entrepreneurs. And in this case, they weren't 21-year-old software web people. They were, average age was 46-year-old full professors at universities. So I think we might have discovered a process that's pretty exciting and fun.
Absolutely. I think that has a great potential overseas as well.
I think so too. So I think there's nothing U.S.-centric about the process. The only thing that's U.S. and Silicon Valley-centric is what we have in Silicon Valley, which is now actually more of a state of mind than it is what we physically do here. It's the peninsula that extends south from San Francisco to a city called San Jose. Our key industry now is not web or hardware or anything. What we do best here is just innovation and entrepreneurship. I mean, just in general. Because what we know how to do here is, do you know what we call a failed entrepreneur in Silicon Valley? It's a special name. You know what we call them? Experienced. That's unique in this cluster. It's even unique in the United States. We don't call them failures. We call them experience. And so the only limitation in expanding entrepreneurship overseas is there a culture that accepts that failure equals experience? 2 is there a culture that's willing to adopt commercially new technologies? And are there markets sufficient to support them? And if those 2 conditions exist, then you have the beginning of something exciting.
So building on what you said, and you've given many talks about the secret history of Silicon Valley, how do you see the U.S. market in general? I know other cities are popping up like New York and Boston and other cities. What's your take on that? And also, do you see something like this happening overseas in different markets?
Yeah, so there's the secret history of Silicon Valley is a talk that your viewers can find on YouTube. It was given both at the Computer History Museum and it was an invited talk at Google. And it was how Silicon Valley actually had its roots in World War II in the United States. But one of the things that people don't realize about entrepreneurial clusters is, in general, they're not engineered to provide jobs for local populace. That is, they eventually do that. But in fact, great clusters like Silicon Valley, New York, and Boston are magnets, are attractors first. That is, they attract people to come there because they are hotbeds of entrepreneurship. If worldwide people are not coming to your city or region or town because it is the exciting place to be, then the odds of it taking off as a cluster is probably low. But if in fact people are coming, to Jordan or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia or Egypt to be entrepreneurs because there's something exciting in that city or region or town, then you have the good odds of this thing happening.
So in closing, and that's usually my question that I ask my guests at the end, and preferably I'd love to have your answer in Arabic. Just joking. What pointers do you give our target audience who want to make it, not necessarily big, but actually make it through the startup phases?
The biggest pointer is an entrepreneur needs to have a set of characteristics that's almost worth remembering. It's a personal checklist. Number one is you have to have a vision. You have to be able to, if you want to be a founder, not if you just want to be employed, but the founder of a startup has to see something in the distance that no one else can quite see. I see what this thing looks like in a couple of years. And they have to be good enough and articulate enough to kind of attract other people, saying, no, look over here, let me explain to you. And those other people who really can't see it start believing as well. So one is, they have to have vision, they have to have passion, they have to have the ability to attract other people. They have to be resilient, because entrepreneurship doesn't happen like the movies. It's not like you have an idea, you get funded, and you make $1 billion. You fail a lot. In fact, if you would average all the salaries of entrepreneurs worldwide, you probably would have been better off getting a construction job. But the outliers are the ones that change the world. So you have to be resilient about failure, and you have to be agile and opportunistic. I think there's a core of every population. This isn't an American thing. This isn't a Chinese thing. This is just something that's innate in some percentage of human beings. Happen to be resilient and opportunistic and agile. And then for your local economy, you have to be realistic about, is there a available market? Are there customers here that I could attract either today or in the next, within my lifetime of either me physically or at least my investor's lifetime of being interested? And I think there just is a wave of untapped opportunities in the Arab world that certainly no American or no Chinese is going to figure out. I think these startups are going to emerge and change the face of entrepreneurship.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Great. This was really insightful, and we'll look forward to hosting you again in future.
Well, I hope to visit you guys overseas.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.